Islamic History, Notebook from Medina, Part 2. This is the second part of our historical notebook for this period. So I'll just jump right into a new story here. This is the Day of Al-Raji, which is a miracle with bees and some very Christian deaths. Sometime around 625, at the request of a local tribe, Muhammad sent forth some missionaries or disciples. I think missionaries might be better. Now, these people were interested in Islamic teachings, and so 6 missionaries, if we want to use that word, were sent out to them. Now, these 6 people, they're on their way to this place, and they're ambushed by members of the Banu Hudhail tribe, or maybe a confederation of tribes that went by the name Hudhail, maybe. Anyway, this ambush happened at a water source in the desert, which gives the incident here its title. So Raji is a well or a water source, which is where this took place, and Al just means the, so this came to be known as the Day of Al-Raji. Now, details on this episode or incident, they vary, but this is not a conventional robbery, the way you would think of a robbery usually being, saying, hey, we want all your stuff. Actually, in this case, it appears that the aggressors here, they wanted the people because they wanted to sell them as slaves in Mecca. And they even went as far as to tell them that this was their intention, hoping that they would accept this fate. Hey, we're not going to kill you, but we're going to make them slaves. Sounds pretty horrible. So unsurprisingly, it didn't work, but maybe they thought it would. So this plan that, hey, we'll tell them, no, we're going to enslave you rather than just rob you and maybe kill you, that didn't work. And a fight ensued. And after the fight, the Muslims lost. 3 of the 6 Muslims were killed, and the remaining 3 surrendered or were overtaken. Now, we'll get to those 3 in a bit, but first we're going to focus on the dead. Now, the leader, a man named Marthad, he was dead, and his story pretty much ends here. But one of his dead companions was a man named Amir, or Amr. Now, apparently, we are told that Amr had some kind of covenant with God that a polytheist would never touch him, nor would he touch them. So, he had prayed beforehand that his body would not be mutilated. It sounds like a strange thing to pray for, but he actually did have every reason to fear that this would happen. As soon as he heard the word Mecca from these bandits, the things that must have gone through his mind would have been really bad, because Amr had killed 2 brothers at the Battle of Uhud. And the mother of those 2 people, back in Mecca, well, she had promised to drink wine from his skull. Yeah, you see how quickly these blood feuds just get out of hand, because you not only have people trying to kill each other, but third parties trying to kill those same people for money. And it seems the bandits were fully aware of this sort of sick bounty, and so they decided that they were going to take his head back to Mecca for a reward. But there was a problem here. Yeah, he was dead, and he was there, but his body was surrounded by bees, or hornets, or something like that, some kind of dangerous, stinging, flying insect. And their numbers eventually became so numerous they just couldn't get to the body. But they didn't give up, and then they planned to return at night when the flying insects would no longer be there, which is actually a very good plan. However, before nightfall, a flood came and washed Amr's body away, and they never found it. So that part is basically a story about God taking good care of a corpse and honoring his part of the covenant when Amr could no longer do it himself. So 3 of them are dead. Now on to the survivors. The survivors were Abdullah ibn Tariq, we'll call him Abdullah, Zayd, that's not to be confused with Muhammad's adopted son of the same name, it's a different guy, and Kubayb, who had the most dramatic death and would become the most famous. So these 3 men, they were all bound and brought to Mecca to be sold as slaves. Now on the way, Abdullah managed to free himself and grab a sword. Now the men who had enslaved him, rather than fight him, they stepped back. Now remember, in these history episodes, I've told you about the quality of an individual Muslim warrior that probably had something to do with this. And maybe the storyteller was also trying to portray them as cowards. But what they did is they stepped back, and they just started pelting him with stones until he died. So they won. And that's 4 out of the 6 that are dead now. And really, the fates of these men get more gruesome as the story goes on. So at this point, we have 2 survivors. 2 of the 6 are left, Zayd and Kubayb. And now the story goes to these 2 in Mecca, and they're at a slave auction. And at this time, they are basically dead men walking, even though in theory they're only slaves, because the people who are bidding on them at this auction are only buying them to kill them. Now, Zayd was bought by someone whose father had been killed by him, so obviously this wasn't going anywhere good. Now, Zayd was taken out of the city for his execution, and Abu Sufyan, it's basically the leader of Mecca now, he came by and said something like, "Oh boy, Zayd, I bet you wish Muhammad was here instead of you. Then you could be safe and go back to your family." And that statement, that sentiment, it's so Abu Sufyan. He just had no comprehension of devotion or anything beyond self-interest. He really would have made a fantastic economist. Now, Zayd was far more acquainted with matters of the soul than Abu Sufyan. He replied, "By God, I don't wish that Muhammad now were in the place he occupies and that a thorn could hurt him, and that I were sitting with my family." Now, this scene, especially the Abu Sufyan part of it, it makes me think of that scene from Godfather 2, where Michael, he sees one of the Cuban revolutionaries blowing himself up. They're in Havana or some Cuban city at this time. He sees this, and he didn't understand it, he didn't admire it, but he observed it with cold, detached calculation. And it's why he decided not to invest in Cuba before the revolution. And similarly, Abu Sufyan is said to remark on how beloved Muhammad was by his followers. And he saw what he was up against. And he certainly never understood this whole Islam thing. And he would never love Muhammad. But I think it was something that he begrudgingly accepted at a distance, kind of the way, maybe respected isn't the greatest word. He observed it and viewed it as a reality that he had to move within. And again, he didn't understand it, he didn't admire it, but he saw, okay, this is the new reality. And similar to Michael, Abu Sufyan would move within that reality. coldly, calculatingly, if calculatingly is a word. He would never love Muhammad. He only became a Muslim basically when his choice was conversion or irrelevance or probably worse. Anyway, back to this story. Zayd was killed. He was executed by someone by an unknown method. But I am guessing his death was not as gruesome as our final guy, that being Kubayb. He will be the last person we discuss here. He's the end of the story. Now, Kubayb, like Zayd, was also bought to be killed, also by sons to avenge their father. And parts of Kubayb's story from here on out, this is what kind of makes it stand out and makes it interesting, is some of this resembles sort of a generic story of a martyred Christian saint, just without the whole love and forgiveness thing. You'll see where that goes. Now, like any saint story, it comes with miracles. In this particular case, this captive was seen eating handfuls of giant grapes before his execution. Now, that doesn't mean much to us, but in the ancient world, in that part of the ancient world, grapes would have been seen as a luxurious thing, and not something you would give to a condemned prisoner, especially one you really hate. And not to mention, these people were in the desert. It's not, I think, a place where anyone would grow grapes. And the implication here is obviously this was a miracle. The grapes were from God. God was feeding him. Now, when the time came for the execution, they decided he was going to be crucified. And before this was carried out, he asked to pray. And for some reason, they actually let him pray. So Kubayb does 2 ritual prayers and then an additional prayer. Now, here's where it kind of veers from the Christian format, because this is the moment that a Christian saint would have likely prayed for the executioners or forgive the people around them, basically imitating Jesus and many of the early martyrs. However, Kubayb went a different way. He prayed for God to exterminate every last one of his enemies. And this adds a bit more of an Islamic flavor to what can read like Christian hagiography. And I think it would be fair to call this Muslim hagiography. Hagiography is basically the life of a saint, a biography of a saint, someone writing glowing reports about a saint. And it's kind of like that, because later Muslims definitely thought he died well. Now, Kubayb was the subject of many, many poems in his honor, and a legend began among Muslims that the people who killed him there would carry a curse. And allegedly, the pagan Meccans actually thought this as well. At least one Muslim would later blame his presence on that day for his reoccurring seizures. And this was clearly something that seared itself into the Muslim memory. Now, to close this out, I want to give you a poem attributed to Kubayb himself at the moment of this execution. Now, this is a translation from the Oxford translation of the Ibn Ishaq narrative of the life of Muhammad. Now, this poem, it actually sounds sort of Christian, Islamically flavored at the time, but there is little here a Christian saint would not have said in the same situation. So I just want you to focus on the content, because this is not really going to rhyme, because my guess is, I've never seen the Arabic version of this, but it probably rhymed and it was probably a lot better. So don't focus on the poetry here. Focus on the content. Now, these allegedly were Kubayb's words at the moment of his execution. This is for God's sake, and if he wills, he will bless the limbs thus torn. They let me choose infidelity, but death is preferable. and my tears flowed, though not in fear. I fear not death, who am about to die, but I fear hell and its all-embracing fire. By God, I fear not if I die a Muslim. What death I suffer for God's sake, I will not show subservience to the enemy, nor despair, for it is to God that I return. All right, we are now to our final story of the notebook, and this one I call A Woman Beats a Jew to Death. Now, this is another story from the notebook that may or may not have happened. This one is actually kind of disputed among Muslim sources. They can't agree on whether it's true or whether it's not true. But that's not really why it's here. It's just so dang interesting. Thus, the headline I gave it, A Woman Beats a Jew to Death. That's attention grabbing, and the story is too. Now, apologies to Hassan ibn Thabit, who is the main subject of the story. At least if it's not true, apologies to Hassan ibn Thabit. Now, this story, it appears in just one history. And in my opinion, it's pretty shaky. However, since you can't libel the dead, here's the story anyway. This story takes place after the Battle of the Trench and during the siege of the Banu Qurayza tribe that followed. Now, to give this story a little extra color, I should point out that Hassan was basically the chief poet of Islam at this time, and that made him exceptionally valuable as a propagandist, and he is highly regarded by Muslims, at least as a poet. But this story highlights other qualities that would be stereotypical of a poet as well. If not then, now. And let's see if you can guess what those are, and maybe how they motivated this story. Okay, so the Muslims are sieging the Banu Qurayza, and Hassan, for whatever reason, he is holed up in a fort with some women and children. Maybe he was actually in command of a fort with women and children. It's not totally clear. But to be honest, this situation confuses me a bit. I don't fully understand why exactly that they would be in a fort while besieging another fort. But it seems that they were worried that there may be some kind of breakout at a weak position. While Muhammad and the Muslims were busy elsewhere, maybe they would bust out and go after their women and children. I guess that's not totally unreasonable. Either way, Hassan is in charge of this fort that's full of women and children. So a woman comes to Hassan and she says, "Hey, Hassan, I see a Jew creeping around down there. We'd better get him before he reports back. He might be a scout." And then Hassan says something like, "Woman, you know I'm not the man for that." Meaning he either can't or he won't go and kill this possible scout. And so that same woman that brought this news to him, she grabs a club, she chases down the Jewish man, and then beats him to death. Now, in this story, I should point out, Hassan is not being portrayed as someone who is reasonable or merciful. This is not good. He is definitely being portrayed as a coward here. Now, if this was some kind of ancient press hit job on Hassan, the intent of the story is to portray him negatively, basically making him look like some kind of wimpy, effeminate artist. Not only would he not do his duty as a man, a woman actually had to go and do it for him. Now, you know how this looks in the modern world. Just imagine a man in your mind. This man has a master's in poetry from a private university. Now, I think that's the kind of image that is trying to be portrayed here, an effeminate intellectual that cannot be counted on in the real world. And this story possibly could just be a shot at intellectuals in general, or at least I see it that way. If you've ever been or are currently in a campus and surrounded by professors and graduate students, that's a wonderful thing. And if you do it right, it will make you smarter. But the other side of that coin is you need to get out in a timely manner, lest you start talking like some kind of space alien and becoming so afraid of offending anyone you can't write a single sentence without 2 pages of qualifiers before it. I've been there. And people like this should not be put in fast paced or crucial environments, let alone one where life and death is at stake, especially in a war. And I see Hassan being in that exact situation, maybe overthinking rather than just making a decision. Intellectual paralysis, paralysis by analysis, they call it. Maybe. Or maybe he was a coward, or thought himself too valuable or too weak to kill that man. Or maybe he had reason to doubt that this man, if he existed at all, was really a threat. Or maybe he was just physically unable because he was sick or wounded. That might be the whole reason he wasn't fighting with the rest of the men in the first place. There are actually a lot of places you could go with this story. And one of the reasons for that is it just has so many holes and question marks all over the place. And in history, no one ever follows up on this. No one ever looks into this to say, hey, was this true? Or gives any other details or revisits it, really, which is strange. And that's a major reason that this is often rejected. How come the people who didn't like him were not writing all kinds of nasty poems about this? Where is the follow-up? Why is that absent? Or, if you want to go the other way with this, you could say, maybe this was something true about somebody important that was written once and then buried. Now think about the moment in time here. This was right at the moment when Muhammad gained complete power in Medina. Now, at that point, how many people who knew about this would have the courage to take on the man who was, basically, Muhammad's minister of propaganda? This story could have easily been crushed by the powers that be. And yet, somehow, it leaked into the historical record. Now, I'd give you my opinion on this. I think I did, actually, but it's pretty worthless in this instance. I mean, every argument sounds logical, and one isn't any better than the other. So we'll just have to say maybe and be okay with that. But it's an interesting story, which is why I told it. That's why it's here in the notebook from Medina. And it's the last story I have. So after this, we will get back on the timeline and move, as usual, through Islamic history. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time. Inshallah.